I will call to order the Finance Committee meeting of Monday, July 25th, 2022, and ask staff to call the roll.
Council President Furman.
Present.
Alder Carter.
Present.
Alder Figueroa Cole.
Here.
Alder Vitever.
Present.
Alder Evers.
Here.
Mary of Quorum.
Thank you. Our first item is any general public comment, of which we have none. So we'll go to disclosures and recusals. Are there any disclosures or recusals on today's agenda? Seeing none. All right, so then I'll just note you got this in your email. We do have two registrants here in support of item 21, neither wishing to speak. Just FYI, as we move into the consent agenda, are there items that alders would like to have excluded from today's consent agenda? Not seeing any hands. So we'll exclude item 38 because that's a discussion. Otherwise, President Furman?
Move adoption of the consent agenda.
Mayor, there is a presentation on 37 too, if you want to walk through that.
Oh, yes, let's do that as well, if that's all right with you, President Furman.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. So we'll exclude items 37 and 38. But go ahead, President Furman.
Move adoption of consent agenda, excluding items 37 and 38.
Is there a second?
Second.
There are seconds. Thank you. Is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of the consent agenda? Seeing no objection, we'll record a unanimous vote in favor of the consent agenda, and we'll go to item 37. Dave?
I will ask Christine to, I think, kick this off and put the presentation up.
It says that host is disabled screen sharing. If I can have permission, I'll bring it right up.
Sorry about that.
I just did it, so go ahead.
All right, so
walk through this, Christine, or are you gonna?
if you can, I have to.
Okay, I will. All right.
Thank you.
You want to just advance the slides then? So today we're going to just walk through the mid-year projections for the various funds of the city. First, with the general fund, in terms of revenue, we're projecting about $2 million more in revenue compared to budget based on actuals through the first 6 months. When we look at expenses, that's a combination of agency revenues, which are going to be under budget by about $900,000, and then agency expenditures, which as of now are projected to be about $9 million under budget. And we'll get into some of the details on the next few slides. So right now we're projecting a surplus of a little under $10 million. I will say that when we translate that into fund balance, we are right now operating in a financial and investment environment where our what's called our mark to market, which is an accounting action that we have to take at year end, where we compare the sort of par value of our investments with the market at that point in time. And right now, just because of the rapidly increasing kind of inflation environment and interest rate environment at the moment. Our investments, while we have a positive return on those relative to where the market is right now, the market's moved a lot faster. So we have what we call a negative mark-to-market adjustment at the moment that would probably wipe out most of that $9 million from $9 to $10 million from sort of a fund balance perspective. But we'll talk more about that when we do the year-end appropriation in December. So when we go to the next slide.
Dave, it looks like Alder Bidiver has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Alder Bidiver.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just, I think I'm just struggling a little bit because I'm used to seeing parentheses as losses. So I'm not quite like I'm trying to just orient myself to how this is being presented. Is
Sure.
it in parentheses because it's different than what was projected?
No, it's in parentheses. We show revenues in effect as a credit, so it's shown as a negative number. So that's how it comes out of the accounting system. And then the expenditures are shown as a positive number as a debit. So that's why we show it that way. So the difference when we're looking at revenues is the adopted budget, we were expecting $341.2 million of revenues. And right now we're taking in $343 million of revenues. So it just shows that we'll have additional revenues of $2 million. And so revenues are shown kind of as a negative. It is a little bit backwards, but in terms of how we think about it, that's how it comes out of the accounting system. And then from the expenditure side, you'll see that we budgeted $350.8 million, but our mid-year projection is that we're going to spend about $342 million. So that's where we get a sort of savings on that side of $9 million. So you put the savings of $9 million and the fact that the revenues are actually going to be ahead, and we get roughly that $8 million. Now on the agency revenues, those are revenues that basically are attributed to each agency's budget. So a good example of that is going to be elevator inspections that are conducted by the fire department. And those revenues come in and they offset general fund expenditures. So we had budgeted 9.6 million of those agency revenues. Right now we're projecting about 8.8 million of those revenues. So that's why it's actually at a slight deficit of about $900,000. So I hope that answered your question, but that's how we present the numbers from as they come out of the financial system perspective. All right, why don't we move on then? So just zeroing in on the general fund revenues, total general fund revenues, as I said, about $2 million above budget. That's concentrated on building permits and street occupancy permits, which are about 1.2 million above budget. I think that reflects the, a lot of that construction activity that we're seeing around the city. The interest on investments is going to be to the positive, but what's going to offset that considerably is that mark-to-market adjustment that I referenced, and that we'll talk about more as we get closer to year end. And then ambulance conveyance fees are projected right now about $800,000 above budget. That's probably driven primarily by more ambulance runs than what we anticipated during the budget development, as the as activity associated with people returning to work or returning to activities around the city compared to the pandemic levels is probably what we're seeing there. Next slide. On the expenditure side, most agencies are projecting a surplus, and that's due to turnover and vacancies. And so the projected salary savings because of that turnover is going to be much higher in most agencies compared to budget. And just a note on the personnel budgets, they are built on a projection, and we estimate salaries and benefits for each of the positions. And then we apply a flat percentage for step and longevity increases that are that employees are eligible to receive. And then we also apply a salary savings, namely an amount that we account for any sort of turnovers or vacancies. So in some agencies, the actual expenditures are going to vary compared to budget, particularly in smaller agencies where if you don't have any turnover at all, you're not going to hit that salary savings number. And that's where you'll see some of the deficits in the agencies right now. Next slide. So here's just the administration and general government agencies. You'll see most of those agencies are showing a surplus. So that's, again, a little bit confusing, but that's the negative numbers that you see here would be a surplus in those agencies, meaning that we're going to spend less than what's budgeted. Some agencies, those shown in red, are seeing a projection of a deficit, meaning that the expenditures will exceed budget. And most of that is due to really low turnover or no turnover in those agencies, or they may have retirements where there have to be a compensated absence escrow payout. And again, we'll address a lot of that through inter-budget transfers. Next slide. When we look at planning and development, all of those are significantly under budget. And again, most of that is due to turnover being in excess of the budgeted salary savings, or purchase of services, meaning budget amounts for contracts are coming in less than budget. And then in the library has a surplus because they have revenues from donations that they don't expect to be fully spent in 2022, and that'll carry over to the 2023 budget. Next slide. In public works, same situation, surplus due to salary savings. In streets, there's also a significant underspending from snow and ice removal in the first half of 2022. And we do expect that we'll have some additional general fund costs because we'll have slightly less revenues from the special charge, just in terms of the various elements of getting that up and running and getting it on the bills. We'll get about 5 months of revenues instead of the budgeted 6 months of revenues in 2022. And then in transportation, again, it's salary savings are driving those surpluses. It's kind of a contrast between fire and police. In fire, there's an expected deficit of about $1.6 million. Now, while salaries are going to be under budget, overtime is going to be quite a bit above budget. And a lot of that is driven by the level of absences, which were budgeted at 8 per day, but are running about 10 per day right now. And then there will be also sick leave payouts to retirees. So this is not altogether unexpected. We did add, as you may recall, 10 new firefighter positions in the 2022 budget to try to address some of this overtime. And that hopefully will come more to the fore as we move through 2022 and into 2023. But there still is some structural budget issues within fire in terms of more sick days being taken than what's accommodated in the budget. On the other hand, with police, they are projected to be about $1.5 million under budget. That's due primarily, again, to turnover. Their staffing levels are below the authorized amount. There have been about 25 retirements and resignations year to date, and overtime is expected to be a little bit over budget, about $72,000. But again, most of that is a lot of the turnover in the commission staff. And then the independent monitor, again, as many of you probably know, none of those positions have been filled. This does project that the independent monitor position would be filled by October. That might be optimistic. We are trying to be conservative in the projection here. Next slide.
President
question.
Furman has.
President Furman, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just, for consistency purpose, I want to make sure I'm following this. These slides say year-end projection, but like if you go up to your other slides for like administration and general government, it says mid-year projection. I assume those columns are talking about the same thing. It's just a different way of phrasing it. Am I understanding
correct.
that?
That's all the same. I think it's just the way it was labeled.
That was a typo. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you.
All right, turning to the other funds. So those other than the general fund, when we look at fleet, I think combination of things are going on here with the additional vehicle sales. No surprise in this inflation environment, used vehicles are very attractive, and the auctions that are held to sell basically fleet vehicles that are no longer needed or are aged out. We've got about 500,000 more revenue from that, but we are seeing higher fuel and supplies costs, so tires, equipment, and so on. And so there's a deficit in supplies as well as in purchase services of about $1.4 million on the expenditure side. Golf courses doing very well and projecting additional revenue, and need to translate that into covering the costs from that additional usage, and so that their budgets are being adjusted. The parking utility, there's an additional $2.9 million in revenues compared to budget, so more usage of the parking garages, and which is a positive sign. And rather than having to use about $6 million of their fund balance to cover costs in the 2022 budget, that's been revised down to a little over $1 million. So that's a good sign in terms of both revenues and expenditures in the parking utility. Public health is over budget, about $138,000. They will need to tap their fund balance to cover unbudgeted and unreimbursed limited term pandemic response employees. But it is expected the salary savings from vacancies should cover that deficit by year end. Revenues in the sewer utility are about $300,000 higher than budget. That's due to the rate increase that was approved back in April. And then the water utility is projecting about $2 million higher than budget. That's not due to rate increases. It is due to consumption, as basically there's more activity in office buildings at the university and so on. Next slide. So we do have in front of you a mid-year resolution that responds to some of what is in the projection. So first of all, there'll be some transfers from centrally budgeted funds to the agencies for what we call carry forward encumbrances. So these are contracts that may have been entered into in prior years, and those need to be carried forward to 2022. We budgeted about $233,000 for that, but the actual transfer is about $535,000. So we'll cover that through an appropriation from the general and library fund balances. And then we'll also make a transfer from the general fund balance to fleet to cover the deficit in fleet expenditures, as was mentioned earlier. And we're doing it this way to help increase our overall appropriation level, which will be an increase of about $1.7 million. And that helps with our expenditure restraint calculation and capacity for next year for the 2023 budget. So as you can see, we still have room in that expenditure restraint program capacity. And that room is what we have in order to continue to qualify for $7 million of state aid. So keeping our growth in costs below a certain rate. So we do have some room there. We probably will make an appropriation in the year-end appropriation that we will, year-end resolution that we'll talk about in the latter part of November and early December. Next slide. We'll also make some intra-agency transfers. So in the Common Council, there needs to be some additional supplies and purchase services funding, and there's currently a surplus in the personnel line, so that transfer will be made. Some transfers within Department of Civil Rights and Transportation, and then within the grant fund for the police department, just a movement between salaries and benefits from purchase services related to the pedestrian and bike safety enforcement grant. Within CDA, they need additional budget authority. Some of that's related to a grant, as well as triangle activity and storm damage and fire related insurance deductibles. So a number of costs that they need additional budget authority for which there are revenues to support that within the CDA. Within the Community Development Division, they need some additional budget authority in the Community Development Block Grant Fund to reflect some CARES grant funding or CARES Act funding that CDD has received. So revenues will increase by 1.8 million, and then associated purchase services budget authority will be increased to cover the homeless services RFP. And then in golf, I talked about that increase in their revenue, and they need that to cover supplies and purchase services costs at the golf course for that additional usage. We also have a technical adjustment in the capital budget. This is very technical, but it's basically the list of projects that you see in the left-hand column there. The first one being John Nolan Drive. There are proceeds that were borrowed back in 2020. And under federal tax law, those funds either need to be expended for the project or spent on debt service within a 2-year period. And we've reached the end of that 2-year period. So we're transferring funds from between projects in order to comply with federal tax law requirements and have sufficient budget authority in these projects, those left-hand projects. These transfers are all net zero, but they total about a little under $670,000. And I think that is the last slide on the mid-year projection and the mid-year resolution.
Thank you, Dave. Questions?
I actually wanted to move a motion and get it out of the way, if that's okay, Mayor.
Let's do that.
Move adoption.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded to adopt. Are there questions on the presentation that we didn't ask while it was happening? Alder Bidever?
I will display my ignorance. Dave, if you wouldn't mind, just the slide where you talked about what we're required under state law, and we have the $3.2 million cap. Could you just sort of walk us, and apologies for those who don't need this, I'm new to this game.
No, that's a great question.
But if you wouldn't mind just kind of walking it through kind of from, like, treat me like I'm a 4-year-old here, because I'm just not as familiar with it.
So under state law, there's a program called the Expenditure Restraint Program. And it's kind of a, an incentive program to municipalities around the state, meaning if you hold your growth in costs below a rate of growth that's a combination of net new construction, that net new construction factor, so 60% of net of that, plus inflation. And if we keep our spending below that amount, the city receives $7 million of state aid. So when you adopted the 2022 budget, that total amount that you approved was about 3.2 million below the maximum amount of spending that you could have and qualify for that $7 million payment. Under this mid-year resolution, we will make appropriations that will increase that adopted budget amount by 1.7 million. And the reason we do that, and we'll do it again in the year end, is that we're lifting that base so that when we apply that net new construction and inflation factor for the 2023 budget, we will have a higher base and then have more room for the budget. Although I will say that where inflation is at right now, there's probably no way we're going to be able to ever have a budget that will reach that total amount, because that factor is about 9.1%. But what will then happen is that all of that underspending will basically lapse back to the general fund at the end of 2022. So we're kind of doing this artificial lift of the budget in order to create more capacity for the 2023 budget. So you had 3.2 million when the budget was adopted, and then we're appropriating 1.7. So there's still 1.5 million of appropriation room for this year. Does that kind of help with understanding?
A little. I think what I'm struggling with is it sounds like it's basically giving us the freedom to increase our budget for the next year more. But we still have to come up with revenues unless I'm missing something there.
So this is totally an expenditure limit. And what we'll find, and what I meant by what I was saying for 2023 and where inflation is at, most of our revenue comes from the property tax, and we're still limited by the levy limit. And our, authority to raise other revenues is also extremely limited. So it's an expenditure limit, but you can only spend up to that amount if we have revenues. In this case, we're making appropriations from fund balance, so monies we already have set aside. But as you know, that's one-time money. So that ability to actually, permanently increase those expenditures is very limited because of levy limits and so on. So that's a good observation.
Alder Wahili?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Dave, can you go back to the second last slide that talked about the CDA something?
Christine, did you put that back?
Yes. So can you elaborate more? First, the community development division, they had, from previous screen, they had extra balance left from their department, right?
So that was in the general fund expenditures. Okay. So what's happening, what's described on this slide is within their community development block grant fund. So that's federal money that they receive.
Okay.
They have federal revenue that they've received through the Federal CARES Act, and they need to have budget authority to spend those revenues. And that's what'll happen in the mid-year appropriation.
Okay. And then the previous balance, slide that had balance of, I think, 300 something or 200 something.
Yes.
Can they be able to give back and ask for RFP to give to the community?
They would definitely need a resolution in order to do that, to amend their budget to allow that to happen. This is what they project right now, I think, primarily from salary savings. Mm-hmm. I'm reading this right. Yeah. And some adjustments for revenues expenditures. So they have a certain amount of purchase services funding, and I think they'll probably be expending all of that. Now, if the council were to decide to make an additional appropriation for additional contracts, that's certainly something that could be done. But that's not what's happening in the mid-year appropriation resolution.
Okay, and my final question is: do any or all the departments have some kind of cushion money that they can use to forward it to the next year or subsequent years? or they have to use it all, and start with fresh zero balance?
So the entire budget is an annual appropriation, meaning that it does not carry forward to the next year. And what you then do as a council, make a budget for that subsequent year based on, the mayor is going through this process right now of reviewing the agency operating budget requests and looking at our projected revenues and where our general fund balance is at and things like that. So this does not carry forward from one year to the next. It's a new budget that'll be that you'll adopt in November for 2023.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Other questions? Seeing none, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any objection to recording a unanimous vote in favor? Seeing no objection, we'll record a unanimous vote in favor, and we'll go to item 38, which is a discussion of the city's 2022 debt sale. Dave?
Thank you, Mayor. Can everyone see that slide labeled 2022 GO borrowing?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I just wanted to walk through quickly where we're at with the general obligation borrowing. We sell debt, general obligation debt each year, usually in September. The proceeds from that debt sale fund the 2022 capital budget that you adopted back in November. And that includes not only the new appropriations that were approved, so the projects that you approved in that budget. It also includes all of the carry forward appropriations from projects approved in prior budgets. We have gone through an exercise with the agencies that have capital budgets to project their expenditures from now through the second quarter of 2023, so we can get a sense of how much cash we expect to be expending. And we compare that with the amount that may have already been borrowed for the projects. And based on that analysis, which we're still in the middle of right now, we anticipate between about 90 to maybe 120 million of borrowing, probably much closer to that 90 million number. And so we'll be going through that process. We're working with our financial advisor on setting that overall amount, and we'll be spending August working on that. The second piece of the borrowing that will happen this September is a refunding of about 29 million of water utility revenue bonds. And we're doing that both to help reduce the cost of this debt to water utility ratepayers, as well as help with funding the 2023 general fund operating budget. And the reason that is helpful to the operating budget is that we're going to issue general obligation bonds to refund those revenue bonds. And that general obligation debt service is excluded from the levy limit. And so that creates levy capacity that we can use for the operating budget because that debt service will be paid for by water utility revenues. What you had before you today and you approved in your consent agenda was an initial resolution for those bonds, and that's required under state law. And the full council will consider that at your August 2nd meeting next week. The debt sale date is September 6th. Now, we typically sell debt at the second council meeting in September. We've moved that up because of all the volatility in markets right now, and the Federal Reserve is expected to come out with another interest rate hike on September 20th. And so our financial advisor recommends that we move up that sale date just because of all of the volatility in interest rates, so we may not get a good price that week. So just a reminder on the timeline, the Finance Committee will meet on September 6th at 6 o'clock. to review and make a recommendation on that debt sale to the full council, which will meet at 6:30 to consider and hopefully adopt that debt sale. The graph on the right-hand side just gives you a sense of the line in that graph is what we've borrowed each year compared to the GO that's both new and reauthorized in each budget over the last 22 years. And as you can see, we don't borrow anywhere near to what the overall authorization is for debt, and that's due to a number of factors, but just which include we often appropriate so that we can contract under public works bidding, and so we don't need that cash right away. Projects get delayed for different reasons, and so on. So that's the timetable. One question we wanted to put to you as a committee as part of this timeline is how does the finance committee meet on that day? Whether it's in person that day at 6 o'clock, or we could set up a type 2 meeting since this will be the only item on the agenda and you would all have to participate virtually in that meeting. I don't know if there's any feedback, Mayor. I guess I'll turn it back to you in terms of that discussion.
Thank you, Dave. There are thoughts about being in person versus on Zoom? Alder Vitiver?
We do have a council meeting that day, right?
Yeah, this meeting would be
Right.
held at 6 o'clock right before the council meeting, and it would last probably 5 minutes.
Okay. So then it seems like we should just be in person, in my opinion.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's in the past, it's been a super easy approach. It is a very short meeting. We really just have to be there and look over the documents. Dave will give us the information, and then assuming we all agree, we'll vote to approve and then move on. It's not particularly complicated. Alder Figueroa Cole?
Please get the date again. The date.
September 6th.
Thank you.
Right. So it would just be right before the council meeting if we did it in person on the 6th. All right.
That's fine. That's fine.
Is there any objection to holding it in person at 6 p.m. on September 6th? Seeing no objection, let's do that.
Thank you.
All right. That brings us to the end of our agenda. Is there a motion to adjourn? Anyone can make it.
Move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Moved and seconded to adjourn. Is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor? Seeing none, we stand adjourned. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your evening.